April 25th, 1945. The White House, Washington, D.C. Rain clings to the windows of the West Wing like sweat on a fevered brow. Outside, Pennsylvania Avenue is slick and black, and the city feels muffled, as if the whole Capitol has learned to whisper. Inside, President Harry S. Truman stands behind his desk, jacket off, tie loosened, a cigarette burning down in the ashtray. He has been president for 13 days. 13 days of condolence calls, war maps, casualty telegrams, and the strange, hollow echo of Roosevelt's voice still lingering in rooms Truman has only just learned to enter. There is a knock. Not the casual knock of an aide with routine papers, but something measured, controlled. The door opens and Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson steps in first, tall and severe, his face carved with age and responsibility. Behind him comes Brigadier General Leslie R. Groves, broad-shouldered, in uniform, carrying a thick folder like it weighs more than paper. A third man follows, quiet, careful, almost trying not to be noticed. The mood in the room changes, like a front moving in. Truman watches them cross the carpet. His fingers drum once on the desk, then stop. Stimson does not waste time with pleasantries. "Mr. President," he says, voice low, "this matter is of the highest secrecy." Truman's eyes flick to the folder in Groves's hands. "I've been getting a lot of those," he replies, but the humor is thin. He gestures to the chairs. "Sit down. Tell me what I'm looking at." Groves sits stiffly, shoulders square. A soldier in an office where decisions kill men continents away. He places the folder on Truman's desk but does not open it yet, as if even paper can betray them. Stimson leans forward. "You may recall," he says carefully, "an immense project, one that began years ago under President Roosevelt." Truman's jaw tightens. He has learned quickly that Roosevelt kept entire wars inside his own mind and handed Truman only the parts he thought necessary. Truman nods once. "Go on." Stimson glances at Groves. The general opens the folder, methodical, as if he is field stripping a weapon. Inside are typed pages, diagrams, production figures, maps with dots and circles that mean something terrible if you know how to read them. Stimson says the words as if each one is a weight placed on the desk. The United States is developing a weapon of unprecedented power, a weapon based on atomic fission. For a beat, Truman does not respond. The rain ticks the window. The clock in the room seems louder than it should be. Atomic. Truman has heard the word in newspaper science columns in a distant way, like hearing about a storm over the ocean, but now it is here, in his office, brought by the War Department and guarded by a general who looks like he would rather be anywhere else than explaining this to a politician. Truman finally speaks. "A new bomb." Groves answers. "Precise." "Yes, sir. A bomb unlike any other." "One bomb, Mr. President, could destroy an entire city." The phrase lands hard. Truman's hand moves, almost without his permission, toward the cigarette, then stops midair. His gaze locks onto the papers as if staring will make them turn back into something ordinary, like ration charts or tank inventories. Stimson continues, steady but grave. He talks about laboratories hidden behind fences, about plants that swallow electricity and men and money, about a desert test planned soon, about the fact that Roosevelt never fully explained it to his vice president, and now the full burden sits here on Truman's desk. Truman swallows. The war room inside his head fills with new images, not ships, not Marines on beaches, not bombers in formation, just a single flash, and a city turning into a scar. He looks up at Stimson and Groves. How many people know? A very small number. Stimson says, by design. Truman's voice drops. And you're telling me this now because I'm the one who has to decide. No one corrects him. No one can. Truman exhales slowly, as if trying to push the air out of a room that suddenly feels too small. The words come out almost like he is repeating them to make them real, to make them manageable. An explosive great enough to destroy the whole world. Truman's eyes stay on the folder, but his mind has already stepped away from the desk. The room feels colder now, not from the rain outside, but from what has been placed in front of him. He shifts his weight, as if the chair has become unfamiliar. Stimson watches him closely. The old Secretary of War has sat across from powerful men for decades. But this is different. This is not a matter of troops and tonnage. This is a matter of whether the future has just been handed a fuse. Truman clears his throat. You're telling me President Roosevelt knew all of this and never said a word to me? Groves answers before Stimson can soften it. Yes, Mr. President, the project has been kept compartmentalized, even within the government. Only those with a direct need to know have been briefed. Truman's mouth tightens. For years, he had been a senator scrutinizing waste and corruption in war production, priding himself on facts and figures. As vice president, he had been invited to speeches and ceremonies, waved at crowds, sat behind Roosevelt like a quiet spare. Now, in a matter of minutes, he has learned that the real center of gravity was never in the public speeches. It was here, behind locked doors, in deserts and laboratories. He leans forward. The folder's pages look ordinary, but the meaning in them is monstrous. How far along? Truman asks. Is this thing? Stimson turns a page with deliberate care, as if not to tear it. We believe we are within weeks, perhaps a few months, of testing a device. If it works as the scientists predict, we will have a weapon capable of destruction beyond any previous bombing. Truman hears the word beyond and thinks of the reports from Europe. The fire raids, cities burned and hollowed, the kind of destruction that already feels biblical. And now these men are saying the scale will change again. Not bigger by degrees, bigger by orders. He looks at Groves. You're in charge. Yes, sir. Then speak plain. What will it do? Groves gives him what Truman asked for, without decoration. The blast will produce extreme heat and pressure. The area of destruction will extend outward. Fires will follow. There will also be radiation, though the full effects are not yet completely understood. Radiation. Another word that feels like it belongs to science magazines, not to a presidential briefing. Truman's fingers close around the edge of the desk. And what are we building it for? Germany. Stimson's face hardens. That was the initial fear. Mr. President, that Germany might develop such a weapon first. Truman's mind snaps to the date. April 1945. Berlin is being strangled. Hitler is cornered in a city that is collapsing around him. The European war is ending in front of the world's eyes. And now, Truman says, voice steady but tight, Germany is finished. Stimson nods. Yes, but Japan is not. Japan continues to resist. Our planners anticipate enormous casualties in any invasion. The room feels smaller again. Truman knows the numbers. The casualty estimates. The growing pile of Purple Heart medals being manufactured in advance. He has read the cables from the Pacific. He has seen photographs from Iwo Jima and Okinawa. He has learned what it costs to take an island. He taps the folder once with a knuckle. So this is for Japan. Stimson does not answer immediately. His pause is its own answer. It is for ending the war, Stimson says at last. And for what comes after. That last phrase catches Truman's attention. What comes after? He knows enough to know that a weapon like this does not belong to one war. It belongs to the world that follows. He looks from Stimson to Groves and back again. Who else is working on this besides us? Stimson's eyes narrow. The Soviets have a capable scientific establishment, but we do not believe they are close. However, secrecy will not last forever. Truman thinks of Stalin, the ally of necessity, the man whose armies now sit deep in Europe. He thinks of conferences, of handshakes, of smiles that never quite reach the eyes. If the United States possesses a weapon that can erase a city, then diplomacy is no longer only words. He leans back and lets the chair creak. For a moment, his gaze drifts to the framed photograph on the wall, a relic of a different time. He feels Roosevelt's absence like a physical thing, not just the absence of a leader, but the absence of explanations, the absence of preparation. Truman speaks softly, more to himself than to them. I've been president less than 2 weeks, and you hand me the power to destroy cities. Stimson answers, voice gentle but unyielding. Mr. President, the power already exists. The question is how it will be used. Truman nods once. Slow. He picks up one of the pages and scans it, though the technical language slides off his mind like water. He's not a physicist. He is not a general. But he is the one who will be asked to say yes or no. A new thought strikes him. He looks up sharply. What exactly did Roosevelt know? And why didn't he tell me? Groves stays silent. Stimson draws a careful breath. He believed secrecy was essential. He also believed time was short and decisions could be made later. Truman sets the page down. His voice firms. Well, later is now. Truman stands and walks to the window. The rain has eased into a mist, the kind that blurs the edges of buildings and makes the world look uncertain. He watches a staff car glide past on the wet street. Somewhere out there, the war continues. Men still dying in mud and jungle and ocean. And here he is, inside a room that has just been handed a new way to end wars, or to begin something worse. Behind him, Stimson clears his throat. Mr. President, I should also tell you that the scientific leadership is confident, but not unanimous. There are concerns about the moral and political implications. Truman does not turn around. Morale, he repeats, tasting the word. Groves speaks, clipped. It is a weapon, sir. It will do what weapons do. Truman turns now, his face set. I've seen what weapons do. I read telegrams every day. Mothers, wives. I can't hide behind the idea that a bomb is just a bomb. The men hold still. The president steps back toward the desk, not sitting yet. He looks down at the folder again, then at Stimson, and in that moment he seems to make a choice about how he will carry this knowledge. Not with panic, not with theatrics, with the plain-spoken weight that made him a man from Missouri who trusted straightforward sentences. All right, Truman says, tell me what you need from me. Stimson's shoulders ease a fraction. He has been waiting for the question. We need your authorization to continue under the highest priority. We will also need guidance about post-war control. And eventually, Mr. President, the decision of whether to use it. The air seems to thicken on the last word. Use it. Truman takes his seat again. Slower this time. He folds his hands, then unfolds them. His gaze is fixed, as if looking directly at the consequences rather than at the men in front of him. You're sure it works? He asks. Groves answers honestly. We cannot be completely sure until the test, but the progress suggests it will. The scientists are building 2 types of devices, different methods. We believe at least one will succeed. Truman nods. His mind flashes to the war as it stands now. Japan still fighting, still refusing unconditional surrender. The American public worn down but demanding victory. Allied leaders already thinking about the settlement, about who owns what piece of the world when the shooting stops. He leans forward. If this thing does what you say, it is not just another weapon. It changes everything. Stimson agrees quietly. Yes, Mr. president. Truman's eyes narrow, and now he seems less stunned and more dangerous in his focus. The first shock has settled into something like steel. He taps the folder again. I want it clear. Absolute secrecy. If this leaks, we lose more than surprise. We lose control. Groves inclines his head. It is already handled under the tightest security. Truman looks at him. Tighter. I don't care who complains. Groves replies with a soldier's certainty. Yes, sir. Stimson shifts in his chair. There is one other matter. You should understand, Mr. President, that Roosevelt and Churchill had discussed this at the highest level. The British are involved in a limited capacity. The Soviets are not informed. Truman absorbs that. Allied trust, already complicated, now braided with secrecy. He thinks about what will happen when Stalin learns the United States has been sitting on a city killer while asking for Soviet help in the Pacific. He thinks about conferences yet to come, handshakes and bargaining tables with an unseen shadow sitting on the American side. Truman looks down, then up again, his voice low. Then we keep it that way until we decide otherwise. Stimson nods. For a moment, the president's gaze drifts. Not to the window, but inward. He sees Roosevelt's long shadow and feels a flash of irritation, not at the dead man himself, but at the situation, that he, Truman, has been forced to step into the presidency with the most devastating secret in human history, dropped onto him like a stone. He speaks. And this is the moment that later becomes the quote, the line people remember because it sounds like Truman. Simple words for an impossible truth. Now I am become death. Groves expects to hear, or some grand line. But Truman is not a poet. Truman is a man who has to make decisions that kill people without dressing them up. He says, plainly, we have discovered the most terrible bomb in the history of the world. The sentence hangs there, so not shouted, not whispered, stated, as if naming it is a way to control it. Stimson does not interrupt. Groves does not move. Even the rain seems to pause. Truman continues, and the edge in his voice sharpens. This is not something you drop without thinking it through. If we use it to end the war, not to prove we can. Stimson answers carefully. That is why we are here now. Mr. President, to begin thinking it through, Truman nods once. Then we begin. I want the facts, the targets, the consequences, and I want options for what comes after, because if we open this door, we cannot close it. He closes the folder, pressing the covers together as if sealing a dangerous thing shut. He looks at the seal, the classification markings, the weight of the unknown. Gentlemen, he says, I didn't ask for this office, but I've got it, and I'll carry this responsibility. He pauses, then adds, voice steady again, as if returning to the first words that truly captured what he felt. The most terrible bomb in the history of the world. The folder stays on Truman's desk after Stimson and Groves stand to leave, as if it has roots in the wood. Stimson offers a final reminder about classification, about who can be told, about how even a careless remark can unravel years of work. Groves gives a crisp nod. Then both men are gone, the door closing with a soft click that feels louder than it should. For several seconds, Truman does not move. He stares at the closed folder, then at the ashtray, then at his own hands, as if checking that they still belong to him. Outside, the White House continues its normal hum. Phones ring, typewriters chatter, a messenger's shoes squeak faintly in the corridor. The ordinary world is still here, and yet it is already outdated. Truman opens the folder again, slower this time. The pages do not look like destiny. They look like paperwork, but each line carries a new kind of authority, the kind no president before him has ever held. He flips through diagrams he cannot fully parse, names of remote sites, in the blunt language of production and yield. He reaches the section on expected effects. Heat, blast, fire. A word that keeps returning like a thorn radiation. Truman's throat tightens. He closes the folder again and pushes it away, as if distance will help. It does not. He rises and walks to the side table where the telephone sits. His hand hovers over it. Instinct tells him to call someone, a friend, a trusted voice, but the list of people he can even hint to is so small it might as well be no one. He has never felt loneliness in office like this. He turns away from the phone and paces. One lap across the room, then another. The carpet muffles his steps. But his mind is loud. Roosevelt knew. Roosevelt had known for years. Truman had sat behind him in the Senate chamber, had followed him into the campaign, had sworn the oath as vice president, never realizing the real war was being waged in secret laboratories. Now Roosevelt is gone and the secret has chosen its new owner. Truman stops by the window. The mist has lifted, and the city beyond looks sharper, harder. He thinks about the boys in the Pacific, about the Marines clawing through coral and mud. He thinks about the Japanese cities already burning under conventional raids, about civilians running through smoke. He thinks about what it would mean to add a new kind of fire. A knock interrupts his thoughts. This time it is an aide, careful, eyes a little too alert. "Mr. President, Secretary Stimson requests that you meet again tomorrow morning. There are additional briefings. Dr. Bush and Dr. Conant will attend." Truman nods. Vannevar Bush, the civilian science organizer. James Conant, the chemist and administrator. Names that suddenly matter because they carry the closest thing to certainty in a world where certainty is about to be measured in blinding light. "Tell them I'll be there," Truman says. The aide hesitates. "Sir, there is also a message from Admiral Lee's office, and General Marshall is asking for time on your schedule." Truman feels the squeeze of it. The old war and the new weapon colliding inside the same day planner. "Set them." Truman says, "All of it." When the aide leaves, Truman returns to his desk and takes a notepad, writing as if pinning his thoughts to paper will stop them from drifting into panic. He writes 2 columns without realizing it. One column is the war as it is. Okinawa, submarines, B-29s, an invasion plan that will demand blood. The other is the war as it might become. 1 plane, 1 bomb, 1 city. He underlines a phrase and taps the pencil against it, not as a gesture of decision, but as a demand for control. In the war. He hears his own voice from minutes earlier, the words that came out before he could soften them. The most terrible bomb in the history of the world. He had said it like a warning and like a confession. Now he needs more than warnings. He needs structure. If this is a new kind of power, it needs fences, committees, procedures. Something that can take the terror and turn it into a decision that can be defended, even if it can never be forgiven. Truman leans back, eyes on the ceiling, and imagines the questions you would ask if you were sitting in his chair. How many bombs? When? Who decides? What target? What warning? What will the Soviets do? What will the world become when it learns what has been built in American secrecy? Then he sits forward again and pulls the folder close. Not away. If this weapon exists, it will not wait for him to feel ready. He opens it and begins reading, line by line, forcing himself to learn the shape of the thing that has just entered his presidency. The next morning, the sky is brighter. The rain washed away, but the air inside the White House is still heavy. Truman enters a smaller conference room with his jacket buttoned, hair combed flat, face composed into the expression he uses when he is determined not to show what he feels. Henry Stimson is already there, along with men who do not look like politicians. Vannevar Bush has the alert eyes of an engineer who has slept too little. James Conant carries himself like a professor forced into a war that does not care about lectures. They stand when Truman enters, then sit when he does, as if the room has agreed to move by his signal. Stimson speaks first. "Mr. President, these gentlemen can explain the essentials in clearer terms." Bush does not waste time. He talks about splitting atoms, about chain reactions, about a release of energy that makes conventional explosives look like toy caps. He keeps his voice even, but his hands reveal him, fingers flexing lightly on the tabletop as if still manipulating instruments that are not here. Conant follows with the practical side, the industrial scale, the urgency. Plants, materials, production schedules. He names sites that might as well be code words. He does not need to raise his voice to make it sound enormous. Truman listens, nodding now and then, but his eyes keep returning to the same problem, the problem behind every technical explanation. "How sure?" Truman asks. "Are you?" Bush answers with a scientist's caution. "We believe the theory is sound. The engineering is complex, but all indications point to success. The test will tell us the truth." "The test?" Truman repeats. Stimson's mouth tightens. "We expect it soon. In the desert." Truman imagines it. A flat horizon, a tower or a crater, men in dark goggles waiting for a new sun. He imagines what it will look like, then forces his mind to stop before it turns into something like fascination. He points at the folder. "If it works, how many can we have?" Conant answers. Not many at first, but enough to matter. Enough to matter. The phrase carries more dread than a number. Truman shifts in his chair. He has endured artillery briefings, casualty estimates, maps with arrows. This is different. This is a weapon that will not be understood by the public until after it has been used, and maybe not even then. He leans forward. "I want a process. I will not have this run on momentum." Stimson nods. "Yes. Mr. President, we have been considering a group to advise on policy, targets, and the broader implications. A group, a committee." Truman hears the familiar machinery of government trying to build a railing around a cliff. He looks to Bush and Conant. "I want you involved. I want scientific voices in the room when we talk about what happens after the blast. Not just what happens at the blast." Bush agrees quietly. "Of course, Mr. President." The meeting breaks, but Truman's day does not. Later he sits with Admiral William Leahy, the President's military chief of staff, a man whose face has seen too much sea and too many wars. Leahy is blunt, old school, skeptical of new miracles. He listens as Truman summarizes what he has learned, then exhales through his nose. "It sounds like a terrible thing," Leahy says. Truman hears his own words echoed back at him and does not correct them. Then comes General George Marshall. Calm as a stone. Marshall speaks about Japan, about supply lines, about invasion plans, about the grinding math of war. Truman watches him and thinks about how Marshall carries death estimates with the same steadiness as weather reports. That steadiness is necessary. It is also frightening. Truman asks the question that is already haunting him. If we do nothing new, what does victory cost? Marshall answers without drama. But the numbers are there in his tone, in the careful way he avoids promising anything painless. When Marshall leaves, Truman sits alone again. The afternoon light slants across the desk. The folder is still there, waiting like an accusation. He picks it up and holds it with both hands, feeling its weight. If the desert test succeeds, the next question will not be scientific. It will be human. Truman looks out at the White House grounds, at the flags lifting in the wind, and he understands that the war is not only about ending, it is about how it ends, and what kind of world is created in the moment it ends. He sets the folder down, speaks softly to an empty room, as if the words themselves are an order. We have to end this war, and we have to live with how we do it. He returns to the practical work because it is the only way to keep the terror from expanding. The next days fill with briefings that stack like sandbags. Each one is an attempt to hold back a flood of consequences. Truman demands clarity. He demands timelines. He demands that the weapon not become a runaway train carried by momentum and secrecy alone. And yet secrecy remains the first rule. When Truman meets with his closest aides, he speaks in careful fragments, leaving out the center of the thing, as if the center is too hot to touch. He sees curiosity in their eyes, the sense that something huge is moving beneath their feet. He gives them nothing, not because he distrusts them as men, but because the fewer who know, the fewer who can leak, the fewer who can be captured, the fewer who can unintentionally start a chain reaction of rumors. At night, when the White House corridors quiet, Truman's thoughts return to the first moment the truth was spoken to him. Henry Stimson's measured voice, Groves sitting like a fortress, that heavy folder on the desk, the words "city destroyed" as if they were a plain logistical fact. He remembers his own reaction, not the public face, not the calm he forced into place, but the internal jolt of it. He had felt the ground shift under his feet. He had felt himself looking at a new horizon where the old rules did not apply, and the words he said out loud still feel like the truest thing he could have said. The most terrible bomb in the history of the world. It is not a slogan. It is not a speech line. It is the sentence a man uses when he is trying to name a monster so he can decide whether to unleash it. Days pass. Germany collapses in Europe. Photographs arrive of ruined cities, thin faces, camps that make grown men stare at walls for long minutes without speaking. The war has already revealed depths of cruelty that Truman did not know humans could reach. And now he has in his hands a weapon that can compress cruelty into a single moment of light. He thinks about Roosevelt again. Not with bitterness now, but with a hard understanding. Roosevelt had carried this secret alone, perhaps believing he could outlive it, perhaps believing he could choose the right moment to share it. Death did not ask permission. Death removed Roosevelt and left the burden on Truman's desk. Then comes word from the program. The test is approaching. A specific location is mentioned in the briefings, though spoken with care, as if even a desert can overhear. A remote stretch of land where men will assemble instruments and shelters and towers and cables, all to measure what happens when a new kind of explosion is born. Truman does not travel there. A president cannot appear at the threshold of a world-changing experiment. But he reads every message, every update, every coded line that hints at how close the fuse is to the match. The night before a major briefing, Truman sits alone with a map of the Pacific spread across his desk. The islands look like stepping stones thrown across a vast ocean. He traces the lines with a finger, thinking of the invasion routes that lead to the Japanese home. Islands. He imagines the beaches, the cliffs, the civilians caught between armies. He imagines the casualty telegrams multiplied by tens of thousands. And then he imagines the alternative. One bomber, one weapon, one city. The room feels cold again. Truman closes his eyes for a moment and remembers the feeling of being briefed. That first shock that made him want to reach for someone else to carry it. But there is no one else. That is the presidency. The decision will not be shared with the public in advance. It will not be voted on. It will not be softened by debate in the open. It will be made in rooms like this, under lamplight, with only a handful of men in the world understanding the full weight. He opens his eyes and looks at the map again, as if challenging it to argue with him. When he speaks this time, it is not for anyone to hear. It is for himself. A promise that he will not let the horror make him careless. If we use it, he murmurs, it must be to stop the killing, not to begin something we cannot control. The next morning he meets Stimson again. Stimson's face is grave but steady. He lays out the path ahead. Committees to consider targets and warnings. plans for how to explain, afterward, what has been done. Discussions about how the world will react, how allies and rivals will reposition themselves once the weapon is revealed. Truman listens and nods, but his mind keeps returning to the first reaction, the first truth that cut through everything else. He had been stunned, yes, but he had also been clear. Even in that first moment, he had understood that this was not just a new bomb. It was a new era, and the first words he said when he grasped it fully were not complicated. They were not scientific. They were human, the most terrible bomb in the history of the world.